A wrestling product will live and die by the strength of its booking. This applies not only to a simple Universe Mode series on YouTube, but to real-life wrestling companies as well. You might think that I'm exaggerating, but lackluster booking decisions are part of the reason why WCW went out of business. If you don't experiment with new ideas, keep your audience guessing, or develop new stars, you become repetitive. Repetition leads to stagnation. Stagnation leads to boredom. Boredom leads to suffering. The last thing you want to do is torture your audience with a predictable, uninventive, or illogical show. Mind you, predictability is not always a bad thing. On paper, Asuka's victory over Mickie James in Toronto was a given. Giving James the belt would have been a ludicrous decision. The intrigue came not from the match's outcome, but in the journey it took to get there. For that matter, think of almost any story with a happy ending that you've experienced. You know that the characters in that rom-com are going to get together. You know that Naruto is going to become the Hokage at the end of the story. The destination isn't the most interesting part. It's the details that strengthen the payoff. We got to see Mickie James return to a WWE ring, and Asuka continued her transition from the fan-favorite wrecking machine to an arrogant, conniving champion. Did I think for a second that James was going to beat Asuka? Of course not. I wanted to see Asuka and James compete, and I wanted to see how that match would influence Asuka's character development. My philosophy towards booking is that less is more. Single moments of shock value are important, but they're ultimately meaningless if they aren't in service of the overall story. This not only applies to storylines as a whole, but it holds a special significance with individual matches as well. All too often, I see WWE concoct these convoluted finishes that leave the audience confused and the superstars either weak or incompetent. Remember when Dean Ambrose fought Triple H for the WWE title at Roadblock last year? He lost the match because his foot, not Hunter's, was under the bottom rope during a pinfall. What? How long has that been a rule? I get that WWE was trying to protect Triple H and keep Ambrose strong, but that just made Ambrose look like an idiot. And don't even get me started on the outside interferences. Kevin Owens can't win the Universal title on his own, can he? Triple H has to lay out his opponent first. Oh, but that was to set up a storyline. Surely Kevin Owens will win all of his other matches by himself. Oh, no, wait. Chris Jericho can bail him out. Good job, WWE. You took NXT's ruthless monster and turned him into a wimp. At least we still have Samoa Joe. For now. When you're setting up a match, ask yourself, what's the point? If you can't answer that question, don't make the match. Theoretically, each match should mean something beyond two guys fighting for the sake of fighting. The story behind a match is as much of an art form as the act of wrestling itself. Honestly though, the purpose behind the match doesn't necessarily have to be anything grandiose. Not every match is going to have an important story beat. You think that Ryback's match with Finn Balor just before Fastlane had any story significance? No. I made that match to give Ryback a credible win going into his title defense with Seth Rollins. However, I also wanted Finn Balor to look strong, not only because he was one half of the tag team champions at the time, but also because I wanted to give the impression that Balor could stand toe-to-toe with a main event superstar. It wasn't anything complex, but the match served multiple purposes that weren't restricted to two guys wrestling just for the sake of wrestling. Here's another example. Let's say that my scheduled match is Asuka versus Eva Marie. I want Asuka to win because she's the women's champion. Obviously, this means that she needs to look strong. Those are the only limits on what I can do. Now, I have to ask myself a few questions. First of all, is this match meant to set up a storyline? If the answer is yes, I'd have to determine what that angle is. Does it concern the two competitors, or will a third person get involved? If it's the latter, who's that person's target? Eva or Asuka? From there, you can break things into more details. But for the sake of this example, no. The match has no immediate story significance. Next question. Do I want Eva Marie to look strong? If my answer is yes, then she obviously needs to put up a fight. As I said before though, I want Asuka to look strong as well, so I can't have Eva kicking out of finishers left and right. She can get a few good shots in, but the win will ultimately go to Asuka, so she takes priority over Eva Marie. If I don't want Eva to look strong, then I can proceed with a standard squash match. What kind of squash match do I want though? Is Eva Marie just going to be a basic jobber? Or do I want to give her some semblance of credibility? If I go with the second option, then I'll give her a moment or two of offense. If I choose the first, however, and I really want to put over Asuka, then I'll have her lose in a few seconds. That's a bit of an extreme example since Asuka is currently an undefeated champion in my series, but the differences won't be quite so black and white as you travel down the card. If your match features two mid-carders, for example, you're going to have more room for competition. In fact, making a more ambitious mid-card battle is more likely to get eyes on both competitors than a standard squash match would. Compare Tyler Breeze's debut in my series to his match with Mark Henry, for example. When you're making a squash match, it will typically be less interesting by default. The audience already knows who is going over, so they're just waiting to get from point A to point B. When you cast some doubt into their minds, though, they're more likely to invest in the match itself to see who comes out on top. Heck, the match itself could be the story. One of my favorite matches is Sami Zayn versus Shinsuke Nakamura at TakeOver Dallas. There wasn't much of a story going into it, but the superstars crafted one through their performance. That match was a showcase of two men who refused to lose. They risked everything, not for a championship or some arbitrary stipulation, but for the win, because defeat was unacceptable. On one side, you had Shinsuke Nakamura, the unestablished newcomer. On the other, you had Sami Zayn, the NXT veteran. The match started slow as the two men tried to feel each other out, but as the match continued, the pace picked up. Sami Zayn took desperate risks to keep up with Shinsuke's strong style. Eventually, Shinsuke slowed things down again and took control. Even when Sami was out of his element though, he continued to fight. Sami wasn't going to win a battle of strikes, but he wasn't going to quit either. You could argue that the crowd wouldn't have turned on Nakamura, but if the match had been spun a different way, Nakamura could have gained some serious heat from this match. Think about it. Sami Zayn was NXT's golden boy. He was there before it hit the network. He helped catapult NXT into the spotlight. If Nakamura completely disrespected Sami during the match, you couldn't have had that post-match handshake. I guess you technically still could, but it would have been far less impactful. You can have a character act heelishly during the match and still be a face, but that doesn't work when you're first introducing someone. You'll give your audience whiplash by doing that. While each match crafts its own narrative, remember that the match card as a whole can have an overarching narrative to it as well. By structuring your card effectively, you can not only dictate the pacing, tone, and flow of your show, but you can also influence your audience's mood or expectations heading into an individual match. There's a reason why cooldown or piss break segments exist in the first place. If you save all of your money matches for the very end of the show, your audience is going to be completely gassed by the time the main event rolls around. And that's assuming that they make it that far. No matter how hard you try to push each match, some are going to be weaker than others. As the booker, it's your job to mix the weak matches with the strong matches to keep your audience invested. You could try the least to greatest approach, but there's no guarantee that your viewers won't tune out halfway through. Conversely, you don't want your best match to open the show and have everything go downhill from there. In saying that though, you need to start strong. The curtain jerker sets the pace for the rest of the show, so if the opener is a snooze fest, we can assume that the rest of the show is just as boring, if not more so. As a general rule of thumb, I'd recommend placing your second or third best match at the beginning of the show. This could even be a world title match if you want. Murphs recently did that in his Unforgiven pay-per-view, and it worked wonderfully because he had an even better main event to close the show. The hook is just as important as the finish, but you should always save the best for last. Use the end of your show as a hook for the next one. Give your viewers a reason to tune in next time. End on a high note, a storybook ending, a shocking upset, a moment of controversy, a prelude to bigger things, or an outcome with ominous or frightening implications. For some examples, here are a few pay-per-views I made in WWE 2K16. SummerSlam featured matches like the United States Championship Scramble, Titus O'Neil versus Darren Young in a 2 out of 3 falls match for the Intercontinental title, and the first in-ring clash between Dean Ambrose and Seth Rollins. I closed the show with Brock Lesnar cashing in Daniel Bryan's Money in the Bank briefcase and winning the WWE title from CM Punk. This would later win the OMG Moment of the Year in the Slammy Awards. Night of Champions featured the final Divas title match and Seth Rollins versus Dean Ambrose in a steel cage. Both world title matches were fairly uneventful when compared against what took place at SummerSlam, so I decided to end the show with the title versus title match between Cesaro and Titus O'Neil. Battleground featured matches like Dean Ambrose and Sami Zayn versus Blake and Murphy, Kevin Owens versus Titus O'Neil for the IC title, and Cesaro's Triple Threat Open Challenge against Baron Corbin and Samoa Joe. The show ended with a World Heavyweight Championship match between Ryback and Randy Orton, a match that called back to their rivalry in WWE 2K14. Finally, Fastlane had matches like the Tag Team Gauntlet, Seth Rollins versus Ryback for the world title before Dolph Ziggler would return to win the belt, and Samoa Joe versus Randy Orton in a street fight. Ultimately, the show concluded with the WWE Championship rematch between Brock Lesnar and Kevin Owens, hands down the match of the night. SummerSlam capitalized on controversy, Night of Champions relied on the scale of the feud, Battleground emphasized the backstory that preceded the match, and Fastlane concluded with a battle of behemoths. By changing the order, not only would each match have lost the weight it carried by closing the show, but the shows themselves would have also been weakened by a lackluster conclusion. Take a look at my WrestleMania card, for example. I opened the show with the women's triple threat to fire up the crowd. After that, I threw in the US title match. You might think that I did that just to add space between the triple threat and the tag title match, but that wasn't my biggest intention. By putting that forfeit on second, it established that this show wasn't going to be as down the middle as people might have expected. They say that anything can happen at WrestleMania, but I don't think anyone expected a match to end in a forfeit at the show of shows. The triple threat showed that I could put together a competent match, but I needed the second match to get people invested in my talent as a booker. I doubt someone would buy into my channel just because I had Baron Corbin no-show WrestleMania, but it served as a small tidbit to get people to understand that everything they're about to see is in service of my grand plan. Next, I had the tag team match, which served to put my editing prowess on full display. The women's championship match was good, but it wasn't spectacular. This match showed that I could push the boundaries of what WWE 2K17 was capable of. Then we jumped to John Cena versus Roman Reigns. While the tag match was complete insanity, this singles match brought the show back to reality. I wanted to show people that, even though I was willing to push the game to its limits, I can still put on a solid match without going that far. Then we had the ladder match, which only reinforced the point I established in the tag match. After that, I had two matches that, admittedly, were the worst on the card from a structural standpoint. I put those there to slow the show down and give people a break from the non-stop tension that had permeated the first hour and a half. I followed the Evolution match with Lesnar versus Nakamura, another hard-hitting singles bout. It wasn't going to be a show stealer, but it was yet another solid encounter. Looking back, I probably should have given that match another 5 minutes or so. Brock didn't even attempt the F5, and I could have had at least one fake out with a Kinshasa. Regardless, it built the tension back up for the masterclass that was Daniel Bryan versus CM Punk. It was definitely my personal favorite on this channel so far, and whatever followed it would not have outperformed it. So I took it slow once again with the Bray Wyatt Sting match. This match had been in the works since Survivor Series, so the build-up alone was enough to justify its place on the card. If I had put the Paige-Stephanie match here, for example, the leftover tension from Punk versus Bryan would have completely disappeared. The methodical contest between Sting and Bray Wyatt could at least carry some of that over into the Iron Man match. Plus, that match sparked a tone shift in the show. Up until now, things had been pretty optimistic save the Cena and Stephanie matches. Bray's victory brought about an ominous feeling of dread. This built into the Seth Rollins-Dean Ambrose match perfectly. I'd assume that most people who have followed my series since WWE 2K15 were expecting Dean Ambrose to get the win here. After all, in pro wrestling, the hero typically gets screwed over until he finally overcomes the odds and gets the last laugh. The tone shift following Bray's win served as a subtle hint that Ambrose's stroke of bad luck would continue through WrestleMania. After that exhausting Iron Man match, I threw in a filler segment with Fandango and the Legends. This gave me some much-needed breathing room between the Iron Man and WWE Championship matches. This segment was pretty lighthearted, but Kevin Owens quickly shut that farcical tone shift down. By the time the main event rolled around, things seemed pretty bleak. That left the door wide open for Cesaro to take home the win and close the book on a high note. But with every success story comes a tragedy. Some people were a bit upset at the less than happy ending, but I think it was a worthwhile experiment. If you're just starting out, I'd recommend ending your WrestleMania on a high note. I have been and plan to continue experimenting with different wrestling tropes, but that's simply because I have a strong passion for writing and storytelling. I wouldn't recommend it to newcomers, but if you've been making videos for some time, don't be afraid to mix things up. You never know what kind of magic you could stumble across. I apologize for wrapping things up here, but there is just so much to address when it comes to booking. I'd rather cut things off here than expand this video into a 30-minute cluster of ideas that lacks a strong central focus. Rest assured that I will be back with another Universe Mode 101 video in the future where I'll analyze the process of writing individual characters and storylines. In the meantime, I recommend checking out my previous installment, where I discuss how to improve your wrestling commentary. If you're looking for more example-based advice in place of a tutorial, I'd also recommend my Behind the Universe series, where I travel back through time to rag on my worst mistakes, discuss plans that never came to fruition, and break down the editing process for some of my biggest pay-per-views. As always, if you want to learn more about me, you can follow me on Twitter at MathWiz97x, and until next time, keep on YouTubing.